Okay, so today we're diving into trust. I mean, something we talk about all the time. But for this deep dive, we're going way deeper, thinking about trust philosophically, like
Yeah.
really unpacking what it means, when it's justified, why it even matters, all that good stuff. And we're doing it, for someone like you with a philosopher's mind, someone who likes to really get into the nuts and bolts of these big concepts.
Right. Because it's one of those ideas that seems simple on the surface. Like, oh, yeah, trust. We all kind of get it. But then when you start pulling at the threads, it gets really complicated. I mean, how do we even define it in a way that captures all the nuances of how we experience it? What makes someone or something actually worthy of our trust? And how does all of this play out in our relationships, in society, in our understanding of ourselves? It's these sorts of questions that philosophers love to dig into.
And it feels like a concept with a kind of built-in tension, right? Because on the one hand, trust is so essential. It's what allows us to connect with others, to cooperate, to build communities. I mean, imagine a world without any trust. It would be
Yeah.
chaos, exactly.
Mm.
But to trust is also to make ourselves vulnerable, to open ourselves up to the possibility of being let down,
Hmm.
or worse, betrayed.
And that tension, that inherent risk, that's where it gets philosophically interesting. Because we have to ask ourselves, what makes that vulnerability acceptable for a thinking, rational person? What are the conditions that make trust something more than just blind faith? And how does that experience of betrayal, that sense of being wronged, differ from just being disappointed when someone doesn't come through for us?
So I guess the mission for this deep dive is to provide a kind of map of the philosophical landscape of trust. We'll be examining its core nature, what trust actually is. We'll be looking at how we can justify trust, its value, its importance in different spheres of life, and even, whether we can actually choose to trust or if it's something that just happens to us. So let's unpack all of this, starting with the basics.
Hmm.
The nature of trust and trustworthiness. What does it even mean for someone to be trustworthy?
Okay, so right off the bat, we need to make a key distinction. And this is something that philosophers always love to do, right? We have to differentiate between trust itself, that's the attitude we hold towards someone or something, and trustworthiness, which is a quality of the person or thing we might trust. So the trust is on our end. It's about how we're relating to them. The trustworthiness is, ideally a characteristic they possess.
So it's like trust is the verb and trustworthiness is the adjective.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And of course, we hope that the two align. We hope that the people we trust are actually trustworthy. And generally, for trust to even get off the ground, there are certain conditions that need to be in place.
Like being in a situation where we could be negatively impacted,
Yeah,
right? If we're trusting someone to do something, there has to be something at stake for us. We have to be vulnerable in some way.
precisely. Accepted vulnerability is key. It means we're recognizing and accepting the possibility that things could go wrong, that we could be hurt, disappointed, or otherwise negatively affected if the person we trust doesn't come through. And then there's reliance. We have to depend on the other person's ability, their competence to do what we're trusting them for.
Right. It wouldn't make sense to trust someone to perform brain surgery if they've never even been to medical school, no matter how much we like them.
Exactly. Competence matters. And then, crucially, there's also reliance on their willingness. We have to believe that they're not only capable of doing what we trust them to do, but that they're actually willing to do it.
So it's not just about whether they can, but whether they will.
Right. So those three elements, accepted vulnerability, reliance on competence, and reliance on willingness, they form a kind of baseline for understanding trust. But philosophically, it gets much more interesting when we start asking, what's the extra ingredient that makes trust more than just reliance? What sets it apart from, say, relying on the laws of physics? Or trusting that the sun will rise tomorrow?
Yeah, because I can be pretty sure the sun will rise tomorrow, but that doesn't feel like trust in the same way that I trust a close friend.
Right. So philosophers have come up with different theories to try to pin down that extra factor. And one prominent category is what's called motives-based theories. These theories suggest that the key difference lies in the underlying reasons why someone acts in a way that's worthy of our trust. So it's not just about what they do, but why they do it.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's about their motivations.
Mhm.
So let's start with one of the most well-known motives-based accounts, Hardin's encapsulated interest theory. What's that all about?
So Hardin argues that for someone to be trustworthy, their own self-interest has to be, in a way, tied to the interests of the person they're trusted by. So in acting in the truster's favor, they're ultimately also acting in their own favor. It's like their self-interest includes the well-being of the person they're in a trusting relationship with.
So it's kind of enlightened self-interest.
Yeah, exactly. It's not pure altruism. There's still a self-interested element. But it's a more complex, kind of expanded notion of self-interest that recognizes the interconnectedness between individuals.
I see. But thinking about this like a philosopher might, wouldn't that mean that someone could be technically trustworthy, even if their motivations are kind of, well, not particularly noble?
Right. And that's a common critique of Hardin's theory. Like, take the example of, say, a sexist employer. He might treat his female employees decently well, not because he genuinely respects them, but because he doesn't want to get sued or, face public backlash. So he's acting in a way that protects their interests to some extent.
Hmm.
But would we really call him trustworthy?
Probably not. It feels like there's something missing there.
Exactly. And that missing piece is the quality of the motivation itself. The why matters. If his actions are ultimately driven by self-preservation and fear of consequences, rather than by genuine respect or concern for his employees' well-being, that feels very different from the kind of trustworthiness we typically seek.
Okay, so that leads us to another category of motives-based theories, the will-based accounts. And I know Baer is a big name associated with this view.
Right. Baer argues that genuine trustworthiness is rooted in goodwill. It's about having a sincere concern for the well-being of the person you're trusted by, or for the thing that's been entrusted to you. And she distinguishes between the feeling of betrayal that arises when trust grounded in goodwill is violated and the mere disappointment we might feel when someone we rely on just happens to let us down. So it's a qualitatively different kind of negative experience.
Okay, so like if my friend prompts us to help me move and then bails in the last minute because something came up, I might be disappointed. But if they bail because they just don't care, that feels more like a betrayal because I expected them to be motivated by a concern for my well-being.
Exactly. And that's how Baer differentiates trust from mere reliance. It's about the nature of the expected motivation. But like any good philosophical theory, the will-based account has faced its share of criticisms.
Such as,
Well, for one thing, can we really say that goodwill is always a prerequisite for trust? I mean, think about all the times we trust complete strangers. We rely on taxi drivers, doctors, shopkeepers, people we don't know personally and have no reason to assume have any particular goodwill towards us.
that's true. And what about those situations where someone places unwanted trust in us? Like they burden us with a responsibility we didn't ask for. Would we say that's a failure of goodwill on our part?
Right. And those are just a couple of the challenges that philosophers have raised. O'Neill, for instance, points out that a huge chunk of our everyday trust is directed at people we don't have any personal relationship with. So assuming pre-existing goodwill wouldn't really make sense in those cases. And in the case of unwanted trust, as Jones points out, the discomfort often stems from the imposition itself, not from any ill will on our part.
I guess another potential issue, and this is just me thinking out loud here, is that we can sometimes observe reliably good behavior without necessarily feeling trust. Like imagine someone who always donates to charity but does it purely for tax write-offs. Their actions are objectively beneficial, but if we know their motivations are ultimately self-serving, it might not inspire trust in the same way that someone who acts out of genuine compassion would.
Right. Jones raises a similar point, arguing that we might not trust someone even if they consistently act benevolently, especially if the values driving that benevolence don't align with what we consider essential for trustworthiness in a given context. So the why behind the action really matters.
Okay, so these criticisms of the will-based account, they've led to some modifications and alternative theories within the will-based camp, right?
Exactly. Philosophers are always refining and revising their theories. Like Cogley, for instance, suggests that it's not just about goodwill, but about the trustee owing us goodwill. So it's not just a feeling, it's a kind of obligation, which perhaps addresses the issue of people manipulating the appearance of goodwill for their own gain.
And Jones, in her earlier work, proposed that genuine goodwill is linked to the expectation that the trustee will be favorably moved by the fact that we're counting on them. So they don't just have goodwill in general, but they're specifically responsive to the trust that's been placed in them.
Right. It's a more relational understanding of goodwill. And then we have others like Lano, McLeod, Mullen, and Smith, who suggest that the basis for trust can also lie in shared values, norms, or interests, even in the absence of explicitly personal goodwill.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if I know that someone shares my core ethical values, I might be more inclined to trust their judgment even if we don't have a deep personal bond.
Exactly. It's about a kind of alignment in our understanding of what's right and wrong or what's important. But interestingly, Jones herself later moved away from the will-based approach altogether.
Really? Why was that?
She became concerned that the concept of goodwill, as it was being used, was becoming too broad. It was starting to encompass any kind of positive motivation without necessarily specifying a direct orientation towards the trust store, which she felt was crucial for understanding trust. So she felt like it wasn't really capturing the specific kind of relationship that trust implies.
I see. So if we shift away from this focus on goodwill, we find other theories that emphasize things like moral commitments, obligations, or virtues as the drivers of trustworthiness. Like McLeod talks about the importance of moral integrity, and Nickel focuses on the moral obligation that arises from the act of being trusted. But wouldn't that risk making trust seem overly moralistic? I mean, can't we trust people for reasons that aren't necessarily moral? Like, I might trust a mechanic to fix my car because they're really skilled at what they do, not because they're a saint.
That's a very astute observation, and it's a valid critique. I mean, do we really need to attribute deep moral convictions to everyone we trust? Or can trust be grounded in more practical considerations like competence, professional pride, or simply a desire to do a good job?
And then we have Potter's virtue account, which defines full trustworthiness as a disposition to care for what others entrust to us, drawing on Aristotle's idea of the doctrine of the mean. But then Jones points out that there are situations where being trustworthy to one person might actually require being untrustworthy to another.
Right. Think about whistleblowers, for example. They often have to betray the trust of their colleagues or employers in order to expose wrongdoing. Or consider situations where you have to choose between conflicting loyalties. In these cases, being trustworthy in one relationship might necessitate being untrustworthy in another.
Which I guess brings us to what some call the thin conception of trustworthiness, which basically boils down to X is trustworthy for me if I can trust X. It's a more functional definition, focusing less on the internal states of the trustee and more on the actual dynamic of the relationship.
Right. It's a more pragmatic approach. It's about whether the trust is, actually workable in a given situation, whether the person can be relied upon to do what they're trusted to do, regardless of their specific motivations or character traits.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good overview of the motives-based theories of trust and some of the challenges they face. But there's another category of theories we need to consider, right? The ones that focus less on the motives of the trustee and more on other factors.
Right. These are called non-motives-based theories, and they offer a different way of understanding what distinguishes trust from mere reliance. One prominent example is Holton's participant stance.
So what's the participant stance all about?
Holton argues that trust is characterized by a particular attitude that we take towards the person we trust. It's about treating them as a responsible agent, someone who's accountable for their actions, rather than just a predictable object. And this stance inherently involves a readiness to feel betrayal if that responsibility is violated.
So the difference is between, like, being frustrated when my car breaks down versus feeling betrayed when a friend breaks a promise.
Exactly. With the car, it's just a machine. It's not a moral agent. But with a friend, there's an expectation of responsibility. And when that expectation is violated, it triggers a different kind of emotional response.
But wouldn't some philosophers argue that this doesn't fully explain why betrayal is the appropriate response? I mean, couldn't someone fail to meet our expectations without intentionally wronging us?
Right, that's a valid critique. And some philosophers, like Jones and Nickel, have pointed out that betrayal seems to imply a deliberate violation of trust. So if someone just makes a mistake or fails to come through due to circumstances beyond their control, it might not warrant the full force of the feeling of betrayal.
And I know Holly offers a thought experiment to challenge the participant stance. She asks us to imagine someone relying on another person to make dinner. We might adopt the participant stance expecting dinner, but not necessarily trusting the other person to make it. So if they don't make dinner, we might be disappointed, but not necessarily betrayed.
Right. Holly's example suggests that the participant stance might be necessary for trust, but it's not sufficient. There's something more to it than just treating someone as a responsible agent.
Which brings us to another set of non-motives-based theories.
Yeah.
The normative expectation theories.
Right. These theories, championed by thinkers like Walker and Jones, argue that trust involves holding expectations about how the trustee should act, not just how they will act. So it's not just about predicting their behavior, it's about holding them to certain standards.
So it's about how they ought to behave, not just how they're likely to behave.
Exactly. And this normative dimension is what distinguishes trust from mere reliance. The potential for betrayal arises when these normative expectations are violated. So it's not just about whether someone lets us down, it's about whether they let us down in a way that violates a sense of what's right or appropriate.
Okay. Then there's the trust responsive, or sometimes called dependence responsive theories, which emphasize the idea that trustworthiness is about being responsive to the fact that someone is relying on you.
Right. So thinkers like Faulkner, Jones, McGeer, and Pettit argue that the very act of someone placing their trust in you, making themselves vulnerable and relying on you, creates a reason for you to act in a way that honors that trust.
So it's not necessarily about having some pre-existing goodwill towards the person. It's about recognizing the moral weight of their reliance on you.
Exactly. A trustworthy person recognizes this reliance and allows it to guide their actions. And while this doesn't require a specific motivation like goodwill, it does rule out indifference or ill will. It means you can't just disregard the fact that someone is depending on you.
But these theories often seem to rely on the trustee being aware that they're being trusted, right? Which seems to contrast with Baer's idea of ubiquitous trust, where we might be trusting countless people in various ways without them even knowing it.
That's an important point. If awareness is a prerequisite for trustworthiness, then it becomes difficult to account for those instances of implicit trust, where the trustee isn't necessarily conscious of the reliance placed upon them.
And Hawley raises a broader concern with normative expectation theories.
Yeah.
She asks, where do these normative expectations come from? What grounds them? Simply not having ill will doesn't seem like enough to justify the specific expectations we place on those we trust.
Right. There needs to be some basis for those expectations, something that makes them reasonable.
And Hawley offers her own account of trust, which focuses on the idea of commitment.
Right. Her commitment account defines trust as the belief that the trustee is committed to doing what we trust them to do, regardless of their specific motives or even their awareness of our trust. So it broadens the scope of trust beyond direct interpersonal interactions.
So I could trust someone to keep a promise they made to someone else, even if they don't know that I'm relying on them to keep that promise.
Exactly. It's about believing in their commitment to a particular course of action, regardless of whether they're aware of my specific trust in that regard. But of course, like any good philosophical theory, the commitment account has also been subject to scrutiny.
And I know Kierton offers a particularly compelling counterexample.
Right. Kieran asks us to imagine a situation where a Navy veteran is being rescued from a sinking ship. He trusts the rescuers to disregard their standing orders to save officers first, even though he knows that's their official commitment. In this case, his trust is placed in their willingness to act against their stated commitment, prioritizing a more fundamental moral obligation.
So sometimes our trust might hinge on the belief that someone will do the right thing, even if it means breaking a promise or going against their usual commitments.
Exactly. Which suggests that commitment alone might not always capture the full complexity of trust.
With all these different theories, all this back and forth, it almost makes me wonder if maybe trust isn't just one thing, but a whole bunch of different things. Like maybe there isn't one single definition that captures all the different ways we use and experience trust.
That's a very insightful observation. And in fact, some philosophers have proposed a pluralistic view of trust, suggesting that the term might actually encompass a range of related but distinct concepts.
So it's like the word love. We use it in so many different ways, but it's not always clear that they all refer to the same thing.
Right. And trust might be similar. But despite this ongoing debate about definitions, there are certain features of trust that most philosophers seem to agree on.
So what's the common ground? What are the core elements of trust that are relatively uncontroversial?
Well, pretty much everyone agrees that trust involves the truster accepting some degree of vulnerability. It means acknowledging that there's a possibility of being harmed or let down. And there's also general agreement that trust involves reliance on the trustee's competence and willingness to do what they're trusted to do. Now, the specific reasons for that willingness might be debated, but the reliance itself is pretty much universally acknowledged.
Okay, that makes sense. And of course, there's the potential for betrayal. That seems to be a key feature of trust that distinguishes it from other forms of reliance.
Right. Betrayal is a particular kind of negative experience that arises when trust is violated. It's not just about being disappointed, it's about feeling wronged.
Okay, so that's trust. Now let's talk about its opposite, distrust. Philosophically speaking, it's clearly not just the absence of trust. Like, if I don't have any particular feelings of trust or distrust towards someone, that's different from actively distrusting them.
Right. Distrust is a specific attitude. It's an active stance towards another person or entity. And it's more than just not relying on someone. I mean, I might choose not to rely on a colleague for help with a project because I know they're already swamped with work, but that doesn't mean I distrust them.
So distrust isn't just about our actions, it's about our underlying assessment of the person.
Exactly. It usually involves a negative judgment about their trustworthiness. We might believe they're incompetent, unreliable, or even malicious. And this assessment then informs our behavior. So we might avoid them, withdraw from interactions, or implement safeguards to protect ourselves.
And distrust has a certain, moral weight to it.
Yeah.
It feels like more of an accusation than simply not being trusted, like it implies a negative judgment of character.
Right. To be distrusted can feel like a personal attack, even if it's not intended that way. And this brings up interesting questions about the ethics of distrust. When is it appropriate to distrust someone? And what are the potential consequences of distrust, both for the person distrusting and the person being distrusted?
So, how do philosophers try to define distrust? I know Holly attempts to apply her commitment account to distrust, suggesting that it involves non-reliance coupled with the belief that the person is actually committed to doing the very thing we won't rely on them for.
Right. So, in Holly's view, if I distrust you to show up on time, it's because I believe you're actually committed to being late. But as with her account of trust, there are some potential problems with this. Like, D. Cruz offers the example of a financier betting against borrowers defaulting on their loans. The financier is essentially relying on the borrowers to fail, but it doesn't seem like a case of genuine distrust.
It's more like they're taking a calculated risk based on probabilities. They're not necessarily distrusting the borrowers as individuals.
Exactly. So that example suggests that distrust might not always be about a perceived commitment to a negative action. It can sometimes be about more complex assessments of risk and probability.
And Krishnamurti proposes what he calls a narrow normative account of distrust, which focuses specifically on the belief that someone will act unjustly. But this seems a bit too restrictive, doesn't it?
Right. De Cruz argues that our experience of distrust extends beyond just anticipating injustice. We can distrust people in our personal lives in professional settings for reasons that don't necessarily involve moral wrongs. It might be about incompetence, unreliability, or simply a lack of shared values.
And De Cruz himself offers a broader normative expectation theory of distrust. He defines it as the withdrawal from reliance in contexts where we have normative expectations of another, due to a perception of their malevolence, incompetence, or lack of integrity.
So it's about not relying on someone because we believe they'll fail to meet certain standards of behavior or competence. And those standards are based on our understanding of what they should do, not just what they're likely to do.
Okay, so much like with trust, there's no single, universally agreed upon definition of distrust. But there's some agreement on its basic characteristics, like non-reliance, and a negative assessment of the other person's trustworthiness.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that, like trust, distrust can be influenced by all sorts of factors, including our own personal biases and experiences, as well as broader social stereotypes. Which brings us to the epistemology of trust, the philosophical study of when trust is justified or warranted.
Right, because the big question here is, how do we know when we ought to trust someone or when we ought to distrust them? And this is especially relevant in situations where we're vulnerable or navigating unfamiliar territory.
Absolutely. And while philosophers have historically focused more on the question of when to trust, there's a growing recognition that the question of when to distrust is equally important, because misplaced distrust can be just as damaging as misplaced trust.
It can prevent us from forming valuable relationships, cooperating effectively, and even accessing important knowledge or opportunities.
Right. And Miranda Fricker has done some really important work on what she calls epistemic injustice, which is when people are unfairly denied credibility or knowledge due to prejudice or bias, and distrust often plays a role in these situations.
Okay, so when it comes to figuring out whether we should trust or distrust, it seems like there's an inherent tension between just trusting our gut and really thinking things through rationally.
Right, because if we try to eliminate all risk through constant analysis and scrutiny, we might never actually get to the point of trusting anyone. But on the other hand, if we just blindly trust everyone, we're obviously setting ourselves up for potential harm.
And it seems like once we do trust someone, it can sometimes make us resistant to evidence that might contradict that trust. Like we might reinterpret their actions in a more favorable light or dismiss evidence that suggests they might not be as trustworthy as we thought.
That's a common psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. We tend to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. And this applies to our beliefs about people's trustworthiness as well.
But then some philosophers argue that not all trust can or even should be strictly rational. Like, think about all the times we had to trust people without having the time or resources to gather evidence.
Right. Bear talks about the ubiquity of trust in everyday life. We constantly rely on countless people, often without consciously thinking about it. And in emergency situations, we might have to trust complete strangers with our lives.
And then there's therapeutic trust, where the goal is to actually help someone become more trustworthy by extending trust to them, even if the evidence for their trustworthiness might be limited at the start.
Right. So these examples challenge the idea that trust should always be based on a rational assessment of evidence. Sometimes trust might be driven by necessity, by a desire to foster a particular outcome, or simply by the nature of living in a complex social world where we can't always scrutinize every interaction.
And this distinction leads to the philosophical debate between truth-directed rationality, which is about forming beliefs that are likely to be true, and end-directed rationality, which is about acting in ways that are likely to achieve our goals, even if those actions don't necessarily align with what we believe to be true.
Right. So in the case of trust, we might rationally trust someone even if we don't have strong evidence for their trustworthiness, if doing so allows us to achieve a desired outcome. Like trusting a doctor's expertise might be rational in the context of receiving medical care, even if we haven't personally vetted their credentials.
But Hieronymy argues that the potential benefits of trust can't justify the belief in trustworthiness itself. So just because it would be good if someone were trustworthy, that doesn't make it rational to believe that they are trustworthy.
Right. She distinguishes between pure trust, which is based on a genuine belief in the other person's trustworthiness, and what she calls strategic trust, where we act as if we trust someone in order to achieve a particular goal.
But then McGeer offers a different perspective, suggesting that what he calls substantial trust, which goes beyond the currently available evidence, can be rational if it ultimately fosters trustworthiness in the other person. Like if our trust signals confidence and expectation, it might actually encourage the trustee to live up to that trust.
So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Our trust might actually create the conditions for its own justification.
Okay, now let's dive into the debate between internalism and externalism in the epistemology of trust. So internalism, broadly speaking, is the view that the reasons for our beliefs should be accessible to us. We should be able to consciously articulate why we believe what we believe. And this applies to our beliefs about trustworthiness as well.
Right. So an internalist about trust would say that we should have good, consciously accessible reasons for trusting someone. And those reasons should be based on evidence that we're aware of.
Like we might trust a friend because we've known them for a long time and they've consistently proven to be reliable and supportive.
Exactly. And Hardin's model of estimating and updating trustworthiness aligns with this internalist view. He suggests that we should constantly be gathering and evaluating evidence about people's trustworthiness, revising our assessments as we go along.
Okay, so that's internalism. What are some of the criticisms of this view?
Well, one criticism is that if we always demand consciously accessible reasons, our trust might always be tentative and provisional, because we'd constantly be open to revising our assessments based on new evidence. And this might make it difficult to achieve the kind of deep, stable trust that's often necessary for close relationships and meaningful cooperation.
And some philosophers argue that the reasons for our trust could be far more complex and nuanced than we can consciously grasp. Like bearers suggest that the reasons for our everyday trust in others are often too numerous and subtle to fully articulate.
Right. And Pettit argues that trust can sometimes function as a kind of social signal, a way of conveying esteem or respect. So we might trust someone not just because we have direct evidence for their trustworthiness, but because doing so allows us to maintain a certain social standing or reputation.
I see. So internalism might have trouble accounting for these more implicit or socially embedded aspects of trust.
Right. And this leads us to externalism, which is the view that the reasons for our beliefs don't have to be accessible to us. So a belief can be justified even if we're not consciously aware of the reasons why it's justified.
So applying this to trust, an externalist might say that we can be justified in trusting someone even if we can't articulate exactly why we trust them.
Exactly. And one way to understand this is through the lens of reliability. So, if a process or a system consistently produces true beliefs, then the beliefs it produces are justified, even if we don't understand exactly how that process works. And we can apply this same logic to trust. Like, if someone has a track record of being trustworthy, we might be justified in trusting them, even if we don't know all the details of their past behavior.
Okay, that makes sense. And Baer's moral test for trust also have externalist leanings. She suggests that sometimes the very act of trying to articulate the reasons for our trust would actually undermine that trust. So the justification might exist, but it's not something we can consciously access without damaging the trust itself.
Right. It's like trying to explain a joke.
Yeah.
Sometimes the very act of explaining it ruins the humor.
But of course, externalism also faces its own set of challenges. One big concern is that it seems to allow for trust that's not based on any good reasons, at least from the perspective of the truster.
Right. It seems counterintuitive to say that we can be justified in trusting someone even if we have no idea why we should trust them, especially in situations where there's a lot at stake.
And externalism also might struggle to accommodate strategies for dealing with biased distrust. Like, if we're trying to overcome our own prejudices and biases, it seems like we need to be able to critically examine our reasons for distrusting certain people, which aligns more with an internalist approach.
Right. To address those kinds of biases, we often need to become aware of the implicit assumptions and stereotypes that are shaping our judgments, which requires a more internalist focus on our own reasoning processes.
Okay, so both internalism and externalism have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to understanding the justification of trust. Are there any alternative approaches that try to bridge the gap between these two views?
Well, one interesting attempt comes from Faulkner's assurance theory of testimony. This theory suggests that when someone gives us some assurance, they're creating a reason for us to trust them. And our awareness of this reason, coupled with a kind of emotional openness to the speaker, is what constitutes trust.
So it's not just about believing what they say, it's about being receptive to their assurance and recognizing the responsibility they've taken on by giving us that assurance.
Exactly. It combines elements of both internalism and externalism. And then there's the more pragmatic approach of simply listing common justifiers for trust without necessarily getting bogged down in the internalism-externalism debate.
So what are some of those common justifiers?
Well, Govey and Jones offer a helpful list, which includes things like the trustee's social role, their expertise in a particular domain, their individual character traits, and the broader social and political climate.
Okay, so it's a more context-sensitive approach. We take into account all these different factors when deciding whether to trust someone. And it seems like the social and political climate is particularly relevant here. Because if we're living in a society where corruption is rampant or where certain groups are systematically discriminated against, that's obviously going to affect who we trust and why.
Absolutely. The level of trust within a society can vary greatly depending on its history, its institutions, and its cultural norms. And this brings up the question of whether we should have a default stance towards trustworthiness. Should we generally assume that people are trustworthy until proven otherwise? Or should our default stance be more cautious based on the specific social context?
Right. And this is an area where philosophers disagree. Like Cody argues that we should generally default to trusting others, while others suggest that our default stance should be more context dependent.
So there's no easy answer.